At the height of a glittering palace ball, a grieving prince, long bound to the memory of his lost bride, catches sight of a young maid stepping into the light, draped in the very gown his fiancée had worn on the night before her death. The music fades, the crowd blurs, and a forbidden pull takes hold. Is she an intruder in sacred memory, or the unexpected key to breaking its hold on his heart? The winter night over Paris shimmered with a clarity that made every gaslight gleam sharper, every shadow seem deeper. Across the Seine, the palace of the Tuileries blazed with illumination, its tall windows aglow like rows of molten gold. Frost clung to the gardens outside, catching the moonlight in a pale silver dusting. The air was sharp enough to sting the lungs, but inside, warmth reigned, a warmth woven from candlelight, silk, and the scent of too many flowers packed into a single breath. The imperial ballroom swelled with sound, the rich, swelling currents of a waltz, the drone of conversation, the intermittent flare of laughter. Chandeliers hung heavy with crystal, scattering light across the satin of gowns and the polished braid on military uniforms. The air held a heady mix of perfume, beeswax polish, and the faint metallic tang of winter carried in on guests' cloaks. Every movement was deliberate, every turn of the head calculated in a society where appearance was as much a weapon as wit. Prince Louis stood near the edge of it all, tall and still, as if carved from the marble columns behind him. He had avoided this room for months, dodging invitations, pleading the fatigue of grief that clung to him like the faint trace of mourning black still stitched inside his coat lining. Tonight he had come because the emperor had asked it, and because refusal would have been a declaration in itself. He told himself he was here out of duty alone, though his pulse disagreed, quickening the moment he stepped beneath the gilded ceiling. The waltz spun on, the floor a living swirl of color. He remembered too well the last time he had stood in this room for such an occasion. Adèle de Marigny's laughter had floated over the music that night, her white gown moving like light itself among the darker shades of the other ladies. She had promised him the next dance. Hours later, she was gone, her carriage overturned in the icy dark beyond the city gates. The memory was a wound that never scabbed, reopening with the smallest touch. Tonight, Louis scanned the crowd with a soldier's dispassion, noting the alliances and rivalries written in glances and seating arrangements. His gaze slid past jeweled hair, glittering fans, and the shimmer of imported silks, until something struck him still. A figure emerged from the narrow service entrance at the far end of the room. She did not belong among the silk-clad wives of ministers or the pale-necked daughters of dukes. Her gown was white, pure, unbroken white, not the fashionable creams or ivories of the season. The candlelight caught the sheen of silk so familiar that the breath caught in his chest. He knew every line of that dress, the way the bodice curved, the fall of the skirt, the lace that edged the sleeves like frost over glass. It was Adèle's gown. His vision contracted, the music dimming to a distant throb. It was impossible. The gown had been put away after her death, locked away. And yet here it was, fitted to a new frame. The woman wearing it moved with the unself-conscious grace of someone accustomed to going unnoticed, weaving through the edges of the ballroom with measured steps. Her hair was dark, simply arranged, her only adornment the gloves that covered her hands. There was no jewelry to catch the light, no sign of the wealth that should accompany such a gown. The skirt brushed over the parquet floor with the same whispering sound he remembered from the night Adèle had worn it, and the sound seemed to cut through him. She lifted her head. Across the space between them, crowded as it was with bodies and light and movement, her gaze met his. She did not startle or look away immediately. Instead, she froze, as though caught in a moment she had not expected, her chin tilting in a quiet acknowledgement that was not deference but something else. Measured, assessing. The ballroom moved around them, the bright colors of uniforms and gowns sliding between their locked gazes. Louis felt a rush of questions, sharp as if they had been fired from a pistol. Who was she? How had she come by the gown? Why did she not look away? Someone brushed past him, murmuring a greeting. He gave a brief nod without turning, unwilling to break the thread between himself and the stranger. She stepped further into the room, her skirts gliding over the floor as though the music belonged to her alone. The distance between them was too great for him to reach her without wading through the court's glittering sea, and for a moment he hesitated. The image of Adele in that gown was so strong he almost feared his own approach would shatter it. Yet he could not stand still. He shifted forward a step, then another. A sudden ripple of movement passed through the crowd, a diplomat arriving late, surrounded by aides and eager hosts. Louis's view broke. When he moved to look around them, the space where she had been was empty. He scanned the edges of the room, ignoring the startled glances of acquaintances he bypassed. The service entrance stood open, a darker space beyond the gilded light. His heartbeat climbed, pushing urgency into his veins. Before he could cross the room, the Empress herself appeared at his side, her hand light upon his arm as she drew him toward a cluster of dignitaries. The Emperor's Minister of Foreign Affairs was among them, and courtesy demanded Louis's attention. His words were practiced, his smile controlled, but every sense was fixed on the far corner of the ballroom, where the white gown had vanished. Somewhere beyond the archway in the dimmer salons, she was walking away from him, each step taking her deeper into shadow. The Empress's voice was a soft murmur at his side, guiding him toward the expectant ring of dignitaries. Louis bowed and exchanged the requisite pleasantries, his responses smooth from habit, though each word felt as if spoken from a distance. He heard the Minister of Foreign Affairs remark on the success of the evening, the favorable impression it would leave on the visiting envoys. Louis inclined his head in agreement, even as the image of the white gown flared in his mind, each remembered detail sharper than the one before. The scent of jasmine returned to him, unwelcome and unbidden. It was the same fragrance that had lingered on Adele's gown on the night they danced last. He had not thought of it in months, yet now it seemed to rise above the layered perfumes of the ballroom, faint and elusive, as though drifting from some invisible current that only he could feel. The circle shifted, drawing him toward the hearth, and a new waltz began, quicker, more playful. The music jarred him. It didn't belong to the mood knotted inside him. He excused himself with the practiced ease of one accustomed to slipping away, offering the Empress a shallow bow and murmuring something about needing air. His gaze swept the far side of the ballroom as he moved away. The service archway gaped dark against the riot of light, and beyond it, the smaller salons stretched like quiet tributaries from a roaring river. He stepped through, and the shift was immediate. The music and laughter dimmed, replaced by the muted clink of crystal, the softer timbre of private conversation. The carpet muffled his steps. She could not have gone far. The air here was cooler, faintly tinged with the scent of wax polish and wood smoke from smaller fireplaces. Aristocrats gathered in subdued groups near card tables or along the walls, their voices lowered, the glitter of the ballroom replaced by shadows and candlelight. Louis scanned each corner as he passed, his gaze moving over faces quickly, impatiently. No white silk. Near the far wall, a pair of officers stood speaking to an elegantly dressed widow, their uniforms catching the light from a nearby sconce. Louis moved past them, his eyes drawn instead toward the corridor beyond, where a footman slipped through a door with a tray of empty glasses. The door remained ajar for a moment. In that sliver of space, he thought he saw movement, just the trailing edge of a skirt, pale against the darkness. He quickened his pace. The corridor's air was colder, the lighting more sparse, the hush deeper still. Somewhere ahead, floorboards gave a faint creak, the sound deliberate rather than accidental. The memory pressed close again. Adele's gown brushing his leg in a turn, her eyes glancing up at him through her lashes. He had locked such images away, certain he would never again face them unprepared. But here he was, chasing them, chasing her, through dim corridors like a man who had forgotten his own rules. At the next doorway, he slowed, peering into a smaller salon lit only by a pair of candles on a side table. The chairs were empty, the room still. A chessboard lay mid-game on a nearby table, its black queen threatening the white king in 2 moves. The fire in the grate had burned low, giving the air a faint tang of cooled ash. She wasn't there. He moved on, turning another corner. Ahead, a set of tall double doors stood open to a withdrawing room. The glow of the fire painted the walls in warm shades of gold and bronze. And there, draped across a chair near the hearth, was a folded silk handkerchief, its embroidery catching the light. Louis's breath halted. The crest, stitched in gold thread, was unmistakable, the Marigny family's crest. He crossed the room in 2 strides and picked it up, the texture of the silk impossibly familiar beneath his fingers. The faintest scent clung to it, not jasmine this time, but clean linen and something faintly warm, human. He turned toward the opposite door, which was open just enough to reveal a spill of light from the next chamber. A sound drifted through, a soft rustle, the subtle shift of fabric against fabric. It sent a current through him, tightening his chest. He stepped closer. The fire crackled behind him. Ahead, the narrow strip of light beckoned. He reached the door, pausing only long enough to hear the faint hitch of breath from the other side. Then his hand touched the polished brass handle. The rustle stopped. The brass handle was cool beneath his palm, the smoothness worn by years of hands far less hesitant than his. He eased the door open, letting the gap widen by degrees, revealing the spill of lamplight on the polished floor of the adjoining chamber. The air beyond carried a different warmth, less the dry heat of the withdrawing room's fire and more the faintly scented breath of a recently vacated space. He stepped inside, his boots making scarcely a sound on the carpet. The chamber was modest compared to the grandeur of the main salons, furnished with a writing desk, a pair of high-backed chairs, and a small table laid with a crystal decanter and 2 glasses. The curtains were drawn halfway over the tall windows, their heavy damask folds stirring ever so slightly, as if disturbed a heartbeat ago. A soft movement to his left made him turn sharply. Not the girl, but an older maid, her figure half in shadow, her hair pulled severely back beneath a lace cap. She froze when she saw him, then dipped into a quick curtsy, her eyes dropping to the floor. "Your Highness," she murmured, her voice low and careful, as though uncertain whether she had interrupted or been caught. "I came to prepare the chamber for a guest." Her gaze never lifted, and she kept to the edge of the room as she passed him, moving toward the withdrawing room's hearth. The flicker of her candlelight slid over his boots, his hand still resting loosely at his side, and for a moment he considered questioning her. But there was something in her demeanor, a contained unease, that made him suspect she would yield nothing even if pressed. When she disappeared into the withdrawing room, Louis turned back to the chamber. His attention went immediately to the curtain near the farthest window. It shifted again, a whisper of movement out of rhythm with the air in the room. He crossed to it in 3 quick strides, the faint scent of cold night air reaching him just as a pair of footsteps sounded in the corridor beyond the chamber. These steps were heavier, deliberate, accompanied by the low murmur of male voices. Louis's head turned toward the sound. Recognition struck. One of them was the Minister of War. The other voice was unfamiliar, brisk with purpose. The tread of their boots came closer, echoing along the wooden floor of the passage. He stepped back from the window, instinct guiding him toward the hearth to avoid being caught in the awkward position of seeming to skulk in a half-lit chamber. The moment cost him. By the time the voices passed and faded again into the distance, the curtain had stilled, its folds hanging without a tremor. A flicker of frustration curled in his chest. He moved back toward the window and swept the curtain aside in one motion, but the glass revealed only his own reflection framed in the dark, the lamplight at his back making the night beyond seem impenetrable. Still, the air was faintly cooler here, carrying with it the suggestion that the latch had been opened recently. He touched it, finding the metal chillier than the rest of the room. Someone had stood here. Someone wearing white silk. The urge to follow was sharp, a physical pull, as if the gown itself were tugging at him through the folds of memory and frost-edged reality. He glanced once toward the withdrawing room where the older maid's candlelight flickered, then back to the quiet pane of glass. Without allowing himself another moment of hesitation, he released the latch. The latch lifted with a muted click, and a thin breath of winter swept into the chamber, stealing across the back of his neck. Louis pushed the window open just far enough to step through. The cold met him like a wall, sharp and clean, carrying the faint scent of frost on stone. Outside, the terrace stretched pale under the moon, the balustrade casting dark, regular shadows across the frost-laced paving. The music from the ballroom was faint here, dulled by walls and distance, reduced to a ghost of melody that rose and fell with the wind. He paused for the space of a single breath, scanning the terrace. Empty. The gardens beyond lay in perfect order, their gravel paths like ribbons of pale silver under the moonlight, their hedges edged with ice. The silence was so complete, he could hear the soft tick of melting frost dripping from the balustrade. Then, a sound. A distant, steady crunch of footsteps on gravel. His eyes found the movement along the central path below. A figure in white moved swiftly, the skirts lifting slightly to avoid the icy ground. Even from here, he recognized the sway of the silk, the gleam of the fabric catching in the moonlight as she passed through a patch of open ground. Louis descended the terrace steps, his boots striking the stone in a rhythm that felt louder than it was. The cold sliced through the layers of his coat, biting at his hands where his gloves had been hastily pulled on earlier in the evening. He reached the lower path, the frost crunching beneath him as he followed her. The garden's geometry guided him. Symmetrical alleys leading toward a central fountain, the basins frozen into stillness. The white gown was always just ahead, close enough to keep in sight but never near enough to call out without shattering the fragile sense of pursuit. His breath came in measured clouds, each one vanishing into the still air. She glanced over her shoulder. The movement was fleeting, but the moonlight caught her face in that instant. He saw the outline of delicate features, the brief widening of her eyes, surprise mingled with something like apprehension, and then she turned away, quickening her pace. The path narrowed as it approached the tall, manicured hedge at the garden's far end. Beyond it lay the wrought-iron gate that opened to the lane outside the palace grounds. He could hear the faint groan of the hinges as she pushed it. "Wait!" The word left him before he could stop it, low and urgent. She did not pause. Louis reached the gate as it swung shut. The iron was cold under his hand, the intricate scrollwork rough against his palm. Through the bars, he saw her figure already moving down the lane, her skirts skimming the frost-darkened stones. He shoved the gate, but it resisted, secured by the heavy latch on the other side. His fingers curled tightly around the metal, the cold biting deeper until it stung. Beyond, she passed under the shadow of a bare-branched tree and was swallowed by the deeper dark of the street beyond the gardens. Louis's hand tightened on the frozen bars, the iron burning against his skin. The lane beyond was silent, except for the fading hush of her skirts brushing against the stones. He stepped back, scanning the hedge for another way through, but the garden's precision offered no such weakness. He would have to double back. Turning sharply, he retraced his path toward the palace's rear service wing. The gravel crackled under his boots, each step carrying him farther from the moonlit stillness and closer to the muted clamor of the palace's working heart. Lanterns glowed in the carriage court ahead, casting uneven light over the cobblestones. The smell of horses was stronger here, warm leather, hay, and the faint sourness of sweat beneath winter's cold. Footmen moved quickly between stables and coaches, some leading steaming horses, others hauling wrapped bundles to waiting carriages. The sound of hoofbeats struck against the stone archways, mingling with the clatter of wheels. Louis scanned the yard, his gaze sliding past the ornate conveyances of the nobility to the more modest carriages at the far end. There, by the shadowed archway that opened to the lane, she emerged. Her white gown was mostly hidden beneath a dark shawl, but the glint of silk still caught the light with each hurried step. Her head was lowered, her movements deliberate but urgent. The driver of the carriage she approached shifted in his seat, glancing about as though ill at ease. The plain, unmarked panels of the coach gave away nothing, yet its very modesty made it conspicuous here, surrounded by the lacquered polish of aristocratic vehicles. Louis moved forward, his strides long and certain. He felt the space between them narrowing until a sharp noise cracked through the night. A horse in the nearest stable reared suddenly, hooves striking the stall door with a resonant thud. Grooms shouted, their boots skidding over the damp stones as they rushed to calm the animal. The commotion flared, drawing the attention of the footman, who surged toward the noise. The air filled with the scent of stirred hay and the hot, frantic breath of the animal. For the briefest moment, Louis's line of sight was broken. When the way cleared, she was at the carriage door, one gloved hand on the handle. The shawl shifted, and a gleam of white silk slipped free in the lantern light. The door shut, muffling her from view. The driver snapped the reins, the horses stepping forward at a brisk pace. Their wheels rolled with a soft, final sound across the cobblestones, carrying her toward the shadowed road. Louis started after them, the echo of the retreating carriage wheels striking a taut chord in his chest, urging him to follow before the darkness closed entirely around her. Louis strode toward the smaller gate at the rear of the carriage court, his breath tightening with each step. The sound of the departing wheels grew fainter, mingling with the dull rhythm of his own pulse in his ears. He passed under the archway, emerging into the narrow service street where the air was colder, thinner, the lamplight weaker. His own carriage waited near the wall, the coachman startled upright at his sudden arrival. "Follow that coach," Louis said, his voice low but edged with command. The driver's eyes flicked toward the lane just in time to see the modest carriage turn the corner. The whip cracked, and their horses surged forward. The wheels jolted over uneven stones as they gave chase, the narrow street funneling the sound of pursuit into a hollow roar. The air carried the smell of smoke from distant chimneys, mingled with the sharper scent of frost still clinging to the road. The white-shawled figure inside the other carriage never looked back, at least not where he could see. Yet her presence ahead was as tangible as if a silken thread connected them. They passed rows of shuttered houses, their windows black against the pale wash of moonlight. The noise of the city beyond the palace quarter was muted here, replaced by the steady beat of hooves and the metallic creak of harness fittings. Louis leaned slightly forward in his seat, the forward thrust of the carriage giving him the illusion of reaching for her. The chase slowed when the coach ahead veered toward a quieter lane, where frost lay undisturbed on the cobblestones. The houses here were smaller, their facades worn, their shutters in need of fresh paint. The modest carriage rolled to a stop before a small mews house tucked behind an unlit row. Its driver glanced once down the street before climbing down to open the door. She emerged quickly. The shawl clung close around her shoulders, but the gleam of the white gown's skirt was visible at the hem, dulled now by the night's damp. Her head tilted briefly toward the corner, as if listening, before she crossed the short distance to the door. Louis descended from his carriage without waiting for it to halt completely. The cold hit him full in the face, but he hardly felt it. The sound of her key turning in the lock carried in the stillness. Before he could reach her, the door swung open again. A tall man filled the threshold, his stance firm, his expression instantly hardening at the sight of Louis. The man's presence was not one of formality, but of intent. His body angled as if to block the entrance completely. Louis stopped, the silence between them sharper than the winter air. The man in the doorway did not move aside. His shoulders were broad enough to block the narrow frame entirely, his hand resting lightly against the edge of the door, as though it could be shut at any moment. His eyes, dark in the poor light, assessed Louis with a wariness that suggested neither deference nor intimidation. Louis held his ground, the frost-whitened stones beneath his boots faintly slick. The street behind him was silent, save for the slow snort of his waiting horses. The thin glow of a nearby lamp cast a pale arc across the man's face, catching the tense line of his jaw. Without speaking, the man stepped back a fraction. Not enough to be an invitation, but enough to leave the choice in Louis's hands. The air inside was warmer, faintly scented with wood smoke and the lingering trace of damp wool. Louis crossed the threshold. The door closed behind him with a muted click, shutting out the cold and the open street. The small front room was plain, but neat. A low fire in the hearth, 2 worn chairs, a narrow table near the wall. On a peg beside the fire hung the gown. Even dulled by the night's frost, the silk still caught the light with a ghostly sheen. The lace at the cuffs was yellowed by age, its threads delicate as breath. For a moment, Louis couldn't take his eyes from it, the memory it summoned pulling with almost physical force. A quiet movement drew his attention to the chair nearest the hearth. She sat there, the shawl still wrapped close, her hands folded loosely in her lap. Her chin was slightly lowered, though her gaze lifted to meet his without faltering. No courtly bows, no elaborate curtsies, only a stillness that felt deliberate, as though she understood the moment's weight. The man remained near the door, silent but watchful. Louis's voice was low. That gown belonged to Adele de Marigny. Her fingers tightened fractionally on the shawl, but her answer was steady. It belonged to my mother before it belonged to her. She served in Mademoiselle de Marigny's household, years before the engagement. The gown was given to her in gratitude. I altered it to fit me. I had nothing else to wear tonight. The words were plain, without embellishment, but each one seemed to strip away a layer of the puzzle. She spoke without apology, yet there was no defiance in her tone, only a calm certainty, as if she had weighed the truth before offering it. Louis's gaze drifted again to the gown, the faint gleam of the silk stirring something complex in his chest. Grief, yes, but not grief alone. The sight of it on her had not simply wounded him, it had unsettled him, demanding a reckoning he had not sought. She did not look away. The firelight caught in her eyes, revealing a depth that was neither pleading nor guarded, but something in between, a quiet readiness for whatever judgment might come. When Louis left the Mews house, the image of her sitting by the fire remained with him, sharper than the winter air waiting outside. The cold closed around him the instant the door latched at his back, a blade of night air sliding beneath his collar and along the nape of his neck. The Mews was quiet, too quiet after the intimate warmth of the room inside. Its narrow lane stretched in a seam of pale frost between the backs of dim townhouses. His carriage waited where he'd left it, horses steaming gently, the coachman watching him with polite, expectant stillness. Louis drew a breath that scratched at his throat and didn't ease the tightness across his chest. The image of the gown on its peg by the hearth would not release him. That silk hung like a memory made visible. And she, sitting beside it, composed and candlelit, had looked at him as if the space between their stations did not exist, as though the single volatile question of the evening contained both of them in its clasp. He had gone in expecting outrage. He had found steadiness instead, and that unsettled him more than any impropriety. Behind him, the latch lifted. He turned back as the door opened a hand's breadth and the tall man stepped out. The street lamp's weak glow laid a bar of light across the man's shoulder, picking out the rough weave of his coat, the fast set of his jaw. He pulled the door mostly shut behind him and came down one step, stopping just enough to hold the higher ground and the doorway both. "You've had your look," the man said, his voice pitched low for the hour, careful not to carry. "There's nothing more for you here." Louis met his gaze. "There is exactly one thing more for me here." A muscle worked in the man's cheek. His hand shifted against the door, as if feeling for a bolt that wasn't there. "You have a palace full of things, Highness. Leave this one." "It is not a thing I'm asking to leave." The words came quieter than he expected, and truer. He was conscious of the stillness of the lane, of the sound of his own breath, of the faint tick of cooling iron from his carriage lamps. Her name. She owes you nothing, the man said. Not courtesy, not answer, not the risk of being seen by anyone who might use it against her. He took one step down, equalizing their height. You know that much about how courts work. Louis thought of the ballroom, 1,000 eyes, 1,000 tongues, and of the speed with which a rumor traveled in that glittering echo chamber. He let out a breath. I know too well. Then leave it, the man said. Leave her. Not without speaking to her. Not after... He cut himself off, because to finish that sentence would be to say the name he had kept like a relic in his chest, and because the night didn't deserve to hear it. He changed direction. Not after she wore that gown into the lion's heart and made it through. The man's eyes narrowed, the first flicker of something like unwilling respect crossing his face and gone. She made it through because no one saw her as anything worth seeing. Someone did, Louis said softly. Someone she did not expect. The wind eased along the narrow lane, stirring a tuft of straw near the step, and carrying with it the faint ghost of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. The horses stamped once, then settled, their tack making small creaks in the silence. The man's voice shifted, not softer, but less sharp. You'll make trouble by staying, for her, for yourself, if that matters to you. It won't be a story that dies in a day. I'm not concerned with a day, Louis replied. He glanced past the man's shoulder at the dark slice of the door's edge, the warm line of light under it. I'm concerned with this hour. This hour is over, the man said. Go back to your world. Louis considered him, this guardian standing between him and the last thread of a night that had already unraveled his composure. He could order. He could push past. He could use the many blunt instruments of his rank. But she had sat straight-backed by the fire without flinching, and he would not dishonor that calm by bludgeoning his way to it. What is your concern for her? Louis asked, and felt the question more than he intended. Brother? Friend? Neither, the man said after a beat. Both, as far as it matters. I keep the door that keeps her safe. Then open it for her, Louis said. Just enough to let a word pass. The man's mouth thinned. A word becomes a rope in the wrong hands. Not if I hold it, Louis said. He let that sit, because it sounded like a promise even to his own ears, and he had not planned to make any. You saw me come. You heard me leave. I did not break the room. I will not break this. You already did, the man answered quietly. By seeing her. By her letting you. Louis absorbed that. The truth of it slipped under his ribs and lodged there. He stood very still, the night closing in around the three of them, the man at the door, the unseen woman beyond it, and himself in the frost-lit lane, caught in a pause that felt like a held breath at the lip of a fall. What is her name? He asked, and his voice was not princely now, only human. Give me that much, if you mean to deny me everything else. The man studied him a long moment, as if weighing not merely the request, but the man who made it. Names are keys, he said. You know that. Keys open doors, Louis said. Sometimes the ones that need opening, and sometimes the ones that should stay shut. A light flared in the upper window of the neighboring townhouse, then went dark again, the watcher, if there was one, discouraged by the chill. Louis shifted his weight, the small sound sounding loud in the quiet. He could feel the balance tipping, toward stubbornness, toward folly, toward a retreat he did not want to make. Was it you who brought her to the palace? He asked. Was it your carriage? The man's chin tipped once. It was. Then you know very well what she walked into. I do, the man said. His hand tightened on the door. I know what it would do to her if word got out that a certain prince noticed. It has already been done to her, Louis said, a short rush of temper threading into his tone. She stood in a room built to crush anyone without armor. She had none, and she still walked through it. I won't let the only consequence be that she returns here and is told never to open the door again. Silence. The man's eyes flicked to Louis's carriage, then back. You talk as if you can help her, but you can't unmake how it looks, not in your world. Then let me begin in this one, Louis said. No promises, no declarations, a name. The man exhaled, the sound white in the cold. You don't give up, do you? Not when I've already lost too much. That landed. Louis felt it in the way the man's shoulders eased a fraction, in the way the door behind him shifted almost imperceptibly under his hand, as if someone inside had pressed a palm to the wood. The lane's quiet grew deeper, a listening quiet. From within, a soft floorboard creaked. It was unmistakable. Louis's heartbeat tightened. The man heard it too. His eyes flicked back over his shoulder, then forward again, as if deciding whether to bar the sound itself. Your name, the man said, as if testing him now. Not your title. The one she would have to say if she dared say it at all. Louis, he answered. It felt like stepping toward a cliff in the dark and trusting the air would hold. Nothing more. And you'll leave when you hear hers, the man said. I'll leave, Louis said, and tasted the iron of the condition. He'd leave the lane. He would not leave the knowledge. Another heartbeat of silence. Then the man made the smallest motion with his hand, and the door behind him opened a hand's breadth wider, warm light spilling in a narrow strip across the step. The shape within was only a suggestion, a slim shadow, still and waiting. Louis's breath shortened without his permission. He kept his eyes on the doorway, careful not to lunge toward it with his need. The man angled himself just enough to block the view of her face and turned his head slightly, speaking without looking back. If you want to say it, he said into the warm dim, say it now. A beat. The quiet throbbed with the nearness of her. Then, clear as a bell struck once, a voice from the shadowed room said, Camille, and the door began, very slowly, to close. Louis stood in the lane long after the door had closed, the single word lingering in the air as tangibly as frost. Camille. It fit her, unadorned yet deliberate, shaped with a quiet elegance that resisted embellishment. He repeated it in his mind, not aloud, as if speaking it might diminish it. The horses shifted behind him, their harnesses giving a muted creak. The coachman leaned slightly to catch his eye, awaiting the silent signal to depart. Louis turned at last and crossed the cobbled stretch to the waiting carriage, the rhythm of his steps slow, as though his body resisted leaving the place where the name had been spoken. Inside, the carriage was dim, the interior still holding the faint warmth from his earlier pursuit. He settled into the seat, feeling the cushions yield under his weight. The door closed with a muted thud, and the wheels began their slow roll over the uneven stones. He kept his gaze on the narrow lane until it vanished behind them, the memory of that strip of light beneath the door persisting even after the darkness swallowed it. He thought of her voice, steady, neither hurried nor hesitant, and the way it had cut through the guarded exchanges with the man at the door. That single word had carried more intent than the entire evening's worth of courtly conversation. As they passed back into the broader streets of the palace quarter, the gas lamps spread their amber glow over the snow-rimmed curbs and the facades of shuttered houses. The city was quiet now, settled into its winter night. Louis sat back, his gloved hands resting loosely on his knees, the tension in his shoulders easing into something quieter, more measured. Camille. The name was an anchor in his mind, keeping him from drifting back into the ballroom's empty glitter or the hollow corridors where memory had stalked him all evening. There was no need to decide what it meant yet. No obligation to name the pull it had on him. It was enough, for now, that it existed, that she existed, not as a figure in a gown from the past, but as herself. The palace loomed ahead, its familiar silhouette softened by the night. As the carriage passed through the gates, the sounds of the city fell away entirely. The cobblestones in the courtyard gleamed with thin ice, catching the light from the great windows above. A footman opened the carriage door, and the breath of warm air from inside reached him like a faint promise. He stepped down, the hem of his coat brushing the frost. The hour was late enough that the grand halls were nearly empty, the last of the guests long departed. His boots echoed against the marble floors as he crossed the entrance, the sound filling the space like a solitary drumbeat. In his chambers, the fire had been banked low, the air perfumed faintly with the scent of the cedar logs. He removed his coat and gloves slowly, setting them aside as though by unhurried movements he could lengthen the thread of the evening. He did not want to lose the immediacy of it, the feeling of her voice still close to his ear. He poured a measure of brandy into a glass and stood before the fire, watching the amber liquid catch the light. The heat from the hearth crept into his hands and along his wrists, loosening the last of the cold from his bones. He drank, the slow burn a counterpoint to the sharper memory of the wind in the lane. When at last he lay down, the quiet was deep, unbroken by the shifting of servants or the muted steps of guards outside. He closed his eyes and saw again the way the gown had hung beside her, the curve of her shoulders beneath the shawl, the measured lift of her chin when she'd met his gaze in the ballroom. He slept, knowing the night had changed something, though not yet what. Morning light slid along the edges of the curtains and found him as if it had been looking all night. Louis woke with the name still present in his mind, as clear as the first breath after the plunge. Camille. The fire in the grate had fallen to a smolder. A faint line of heat touched his face. The scent of cedar softened into something like memory. He lay still for a moment, feeling the ache of fatigue threaded through with a steadier pulse, as if the rest he'd managed had settled sand over a shaken ground without obscuring what lay beneath. He rose when the hour demanded it, the quiet of his rooms unbroken save for the distant footfalls of servants in the corridor and the dulled clink of metal from the guard below. He dressed with unhurried hands, conscious of the small rituals, the clean linen, the familiar weight of the coat, each movement gathering him back into himself. The palace would fill again by evening, the celebrations continuing in obedience to the emperor's calendar. He felt the future closing around that fact with the certainty of a latch catching. In the late afternoon, the winter sky paled to a soft pewter. Lanterns along the corridors bloomed one by one as the light declined, their flames moving faintly when doors opened and closed. He crossed the length of a gallery and paused at a window. The gardens below lay in cold precision, the frozen fountain like a piece of carved glass. Somewhere inside the building, a violin sounded, just a fragment, as if someone had pulled a bow over strings to test the instrument and stopped before the note became song. By the time he entered the antechamber to the ballroom, the familiar hum had gathered. Voices layered over the rustle of skirts, the low scrape of chairs being set in order, a footman's shoes brisk on the waxed floor. He felt the old reflexive tightening, the sense of stepping onto a stage he had not chosen, and then another feeling rose beneath it, steadier, as if he were walking toward a point he had chosen after all. The doors opened. Candlelight poured over him, the chandeliers lavish as constellations, the gilt and mirror of the room throwing light back and back until even the dark corners held a sheen. Guests arranged themselves in graceful eddies, the ladies' gowns a muted winter garden of gray-blue, plum, and pale gold. Music hovered, strings in a gentle murmur as the orchestra tuned. He didn't look for anyone else. He looked for her. She was there, at the periphery where the servants moved like careful shadows among the guests. No white silk tonight, only the modest uniform of her place, the plain lines disguising nothing and diminishing nothing. She carried a tray of glasses with steady hands, the curve of the glass a small constellation moving at the edge of the greater brightness. Her hair was neatly arranged. The light found a strand and set it aglow for an instant before she passed beyond it. She sensed him even before she lifted her eyes. He felt it, that minute alteration in the air between two people who have become aware of each other in a room that belongs to everyone else. Then her gaze rose and met his. There was no startle in it, no flight. Just recognition, and something he read as courage. Not the loud kind that draws notice, but the quiet kind that does not waver. He crossed to her with the only certainty he had needed all day. A murmur followed him, names spoken under breath, the quickening attention of people trained to see significance in every deviation from custom. He let the sound pass over him. When he reached her, he stopped close enough that the faint warmth of her skin seemed to reach through the cool polish of the evening. "Camille," he said, the name softened by the nearness, made private in the midst of an audience. "Will you dance with me?" Her lashes lowered a fraction, not as a retreat but as acceptance of the weight of the moment. "Your Highness," she said, her voice low and even. "I am here to serve." "Then serve me this," he answered, gentler. A single waltz. For a heartbeat, the press of the room grew louder, and then, as if a decision had moved through her like breath, she set the tray upon a side table with unshaking hands. She removed her gloves, plain kid, worn smooth at the fingertips, and laid them beside the glasses. When she placed her hand in his, the contact was light, but the effect was not. His pulse climbed once, sharply, then steadied against her calm. They stepped toward the floor as the orchestra lifted its bows. The first notes unfurled, an old waltz, the one that had last filled this room for him not with music, but with absence. The recognition struck him like cold, and then melted as he drew her into the turn. The room opened to their movement, the circle of space breathing with them, as if it had been waiting since that long-ago night to be inhabited again. "You know," he said quietly, his breath a thread between them as they turned. "What music this is." "I know," she replied, not tightening her fingers in his, not withdrawing them either. "It belongs to your sorrow." "Not tonight," he said. He felt the words as he spoke them, discovered them, as if he were listening to someone else tell him what to do, and finding he agreed. Not any longer. The waltz drew them into its pattern. Her steps were sure, unadorned, perfectly placed. She danced like a woman who had learned to move without taking more space than the world thought she should, and who, for these minutes, would take exactly what was hers. The scent of her reached him, clean, faintly floral, nothing of jasmine, and the distinction soothed rather than stung. He became acutely aware of small things, the light brush of her skirt against his boot, the curve of her shoulder under the plain fabric, the warmth of her palm, neither clammy with fear nor cold with calculation. Around them, the court's gaze fixed and shifted, recalibrating. He was not immune to the heat of it along his back, the pressure of unseen thoughts gathering, judging, measuring. He could picture the quick tilt of fans behind which words took shape. But the world had narrowed to the space they occupied, and the discipline of steps learned long ago, now repurposed, not as memory's reenactment, but as proof that his body would obey a new command. "You walked through the palace in her gown," he said, the phrase not accusation, but acknowledgement. "You must have known what it would do." She lifted her eyes to his, and the steadiness there moved him because it contained no apology where there was none required. "I knew what I had," she said, "and I knew I had to enter a room where clothing is a kind of language." "And what did you say?" he asked softly. "With that language?" "That I would not be invisible," she answered, as if the words had been waiting for this exact moment to be called into the air. "Not to myself." Something eased in him, deep and decisive. He had not known he was braced for the answer until he felt the release, like a last knot pulled free. The music folded them into another turn, their bodies adjusting to the curve of the floor with a precision that felt like trust. A figure brushed near, someone of consequence he knew by the prickle of attention it stirred in the crowd, but did not cut across their path. The orchestra moved into the waltz's middle movement, the strings swelling into richer harmony. He felt heat rise through him, not feverish, not frantic, a warmth like thaw, controlled and sure. "Camille," he said, tasting the syllables again, letting them anchor him. "You gave me back the night by changing it." She held his gaze. "You took it back by choosing this dance." He almost smiled. It was a small lifting at the corner of his mouth that felt like sunlight prying through a narrow opening. "Then we are both guilty of living," she said, and there was the slightest breath of wryness that made the word more beautiful than he'd expected it to be. For the space of a long measure, they didn't speak. The conversation settled into their bodies, into the give and return of balance, the forward step and the turn that asked for trust and returned it. He realized that grief, however large, did not prohibit the body from learning new steps, that love, however undefended, might begin in a room where it was least convenient to let it. The last phrases approached, the music gathering itself for the cadence. He felt the room tighten as if anticipating an ending that would tell them how to interpret all that had come before. He did not look away from her to check. He leaned, instead, into the refinement of the closing turn and into the breath that lifted and fell in her chest, matching his. When the final chord sounded, they came to stillness, almost without weight. The world rushed back with a soft roar, applause like rain on a garden, whispers chasing their tails along the walls. He did not release her hand. She did not attempt to withdraw it. "Thank you," he said. And the words, simple as they were, felt like a vow to the present, not an epitaph to the past. She inclined her head, and for the first time that night, he saw a hint of color rise along her cheekbones, a flush not of shame, but of feeling honestly met. "You're welcome," she said. It was nothing. It was everything. He lifted her hand and set it carefully against his arm, escorting her to the edge of the floor, where the world might claim her again, and where it might attempt, foolishly, to claim him. The court would do what it always did: observe, assume, repeat. He let it. The choice had already been made in the only place it mattered. At the margin of the room, he paused with her, letting the sweep of the ballroom curve past like a river, letting the moment hold. "Tonight," he said very low, "I remember without breaking." She looked up at him with a quiet that was not submission and not defiance. "Tonight," she answered, "you're not alone in it." He felt it then, the astonishing mercy of being met halfway on a bridge he hadn't known how to build. His hand tightened slightly, where her fingers rested on his arm, a pressure she returned. The orchestra began a new piece, the downbeat crisp, a different rhythm altogether. He drew a breath that filled him fully and did not ache. In the mirror across the room, a shimmer of their reflection trembled for an instant and steadied, two figures not ghosted by anyone else's outline. Under the blaze of the chandeliers, with the city winter cold beyond the walls and the world insistent at their backs, he leaned close enough that only she could hear and said the one true thing that had formed in him since he'd heard her name in the cold. "Stay." And when she nodded, the night turned from a wound into a beginning. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you like the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.